The static crackled through the burning ruins of Arnhem. A British radio operator crouched in the wreckage of what had once been a Dutch townhouse, transmitting into silence. Around him, the dead lay where they had fallen. 4 days of continuous fighting had reduced 740 men to fewer than 100 still able to hold a weapon. German tanks fired point-blank into the remaining buildings. Ammunition was gone. Water was gone. The men who had been promised relief in 48 hours had held for 96. The final transmission went out into the September air, 5 words. No one on the Allied side heard them. Out of ammo. God save the King. These men were told the war would be over by Christmas. To understand how it came to this, we must return to the headiest days of Allied triumph and the fatal gamble that followed. In the summer of 1944, the Allied armies were drunk on victory. The breakout from Normandy had exceeded every expectation. Paris fell on the 25th of August, Brussels on the 3rd of September, Antwerp, Europe's largest port, on the 4th. The German Wehrmacht, which had terrorized a continent for 5 years, appeared to be disintegrating before the Allied advance. Between the 6th of June and the 14th of August, the Germans had suffered more than 280,000 casualties, including nearly 200,000 missing or captured. Entire divisions had simply ceased to exist. The intelligence assessment from Supreme Headquarters was blunt. The enemy in the West has had it. Allied commanders raised their sights from the next river crossing to Berlin itself. The war that had seemed endless now appeared to have an expiration date. Christmas 1944, perhaps sooner. But the very speed of the advance had created a crisis. Supply lines still stretched back to the Normandy beaches, more than 400 miles from the front. Fuel was so scarce that entire divisions sat idle while their tanks waited for petrol. General George Patton's Third Army, racing toward the German frontier, ground to a halt for lack of gasoline. The Allied war machine had outrun its own logistics. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery saw an opportunity in the chaos. The British commander had been pressing for what he called a narrow thrust, a concentrated blow that would punch through the German defenses and drive straight for the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. If the Allies could cross the Rhine before winter, Montgomery argued, the war could be ended in weeks. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, favored a broader approach, advancing along the entire front. But Montgomery was persuasive. And he had a plan. The concept was breathtaking in its ambition. 3 airborne divisions would drop behind German lines in the Netherlands, seizing a series of bridges across the major rivers and canals. A ground force would then race north along a single road, linking up with each airborne force in turn. The final objective was a bridge over the lower Rhine at the Dutch city of Arnhem. Once across the Rhine, the road to Germany lay open. The operation would be called Market Garden, Market for the airborne assault, Garden for the ground advance. It would be the largest airborne operation in the history of warfare. More than 35,000 paratroopers and glider troops would descend on the Netherlands in a single day. Nearly 1,500 transport aircraft and 500 gliders would fill the skies. If it worked, it would end the war. The plan divided responsibilities with geographic precision. The American 101st Airborne Division under Major General Maxwell Taylor would secure the southernmost bridges near Eindhoven and the town of Sun. The American 82nd Airborne under Brigadier General James Gavin would take the middle section, including the crucial bridge at Nijmegen over the River Wall. The British 1st Airborne Division under Major General Roy Urquhart, along with the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade under Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski, would capture the prize, the bridge at Arnhem over the lower Rhine. Once the airborne troops had their bridges, the British 30th Corps under Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks would advance north from Belgium, linking up with each division in sequence. The entire operation was expected to take 48 hours, but the plan carried fatal compromises from its inception. There were not enough transport aircraft to deliver all the troops in a single lift. The drops would have to be spread across 3 days, sacrificing surprise after the first wave. The British landing zones near Arnhem were placed 8 miles from the bridge itself, a distance that would take hours to cover on foot. No glider assault would land directly on the objective, as had been done so successfully at Pegasus Bridge on D-Day. And the entire ground advance depended on a single road, Highway 69, a two-lane ribbon of asphalt, threading through Dutch polder and marshland. If that road was blocked, the entire operation would stall. There were those who saw disaster coming. Dutch resistance fighters reported German armor moving into the Arnhem area. Royal Air Force reconnaissance aircraft photographed tanks in the woods near the planned drop zones. Ultra-intercepts from Bletchley Park confirmed that the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions had moved to the area north and east of Arnhem to rest and refit after their mauling in Normandy. Major Brian Urquhart, the chief intelligence officer for the British 1st Airborne Corps, studied the photographs and the reports with growing alarm. He brought his concerns directly to Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, who commanded the Airborne Corps. 2 SS Panzer divisions were positioned directly in the path of the 1st Airborne Division. The lightly armed paratroopers would be landing on top of German armor. Browning dismissed the warnings. The intelligence was placed Urquhart on medical leave for what was termed nervous exhaustion. His career in the airborne forces was effectively over. When Browning was briefed on the timeline, told that the paratroopers at Arnhem would need to hold their bridge for just 2 days before relief arrived, he offered a measured response. The airborne troops could hold for 4 days, he said, but then he added a caveat that would become the epitaph of the entire operation. "I think we might be going a bridge too far." The warning was spoken, and then it was ignored. The troops themselves knew nothing of the intelligence debates. They knew only that they were finally going into action after months of canceled operations. 18 separate airborne missions had been planned and scrubbed since D-Day, each time because the ground forces had advanced too quickly and overrun the objectives. The paratroopers were eager, frustrated, and supremely confident. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, who would command the battalion tasked with seizing the Arnhem Bridge itself, was so certain of a quick victory that he instructed his Batman to pack a dinner jacket and golf clubs for the liberation celebrations. On the morning of the 17th of September, 1944, the skies over England filled with aircraft. Nearly 1,500 transports and 500 gliders formed up in endless streams, turning south toward the Netherlands. Aboard the aircraft, men checked their equipment, smoked cigarettes, and contemplated what lay ahead. Most expected to be home within the week. They did not know that waiting for them in a quiet village 8 miles from the Arnhem Bridge was a German commander whose name had become synonymous with defensive genius. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, had chosen the Dutch town of Oosterbeek for his headquarters. It lay directly beneath the flight path of the approaching armada. Model had no intention of surrendering the Rhine. The first paratroopers exited their aircraft at 1:30 on the afternoon of September 17th. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, light winds, visibility stretching for miles. Across the flat Dutch countryside, the descending parachutes looked like clouds of cotton drifting to earth. In the towns and villages below, Dutch civilians poured into the streets, waving orange banners, embracing the soldiers as they landed. After 4 years of German occupation, liberation had finally come. Or so they believed. The American divisions landed with textbook precision. The 101st Airborne came down near Eindhoven and immediately pushed toward their objectives. Within hours, Taylor's men had secured 4 of the 5 bridges assigned to them. Only at sun did the plan falter. German engineers blew the bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal just as the first American paratroopers came within sight of it. The loss would cost precious hours while engineers constructed a replacement. 50 miles to the north, the 82nd Airborne seized the massive bridge at Grave in a coup de main assault, landing gliders directly on the objective before the Germans could react. But General Gavin, mindful of intelligence reports warning of German armor in the forests to the east, directed much of his force to secure the high ground at Groesbeek, rather than immediately pushing for the Great Road Bridge at Nijmegen. It was a decision that would prove fateful. The Nijmegen Bridge, the largest in the Netherlands, remained in German hands. At the northern end of the corridor, the British 1st Airborne Division descended onto open heathland west of Arnhem. The drop zones were 8 miles from the bridge. 8 miles of Dutch suburbs, woodland, and urban streets that would have to be covered on foot before the objective could be reached. 3 battalions of the 1st Parachute Brigade set out along 3 separate routes, each hoping to find a clear path to the Rhine. They did not know that their landing had been observed by the one German commander best equipped to stop them. Field Marshal Walter Model was eating lunch at the Hotel Tafelberg in Oosterbeek when he heard the drone of aircraft engines. He stepped to the window and watched the sky fill with transport planes. For a moment, Model believed the paratroopers had come specifically to capture him. He was, after all, one of the highest-ranking German officers on the Western Front, the man Hitler called his fireman for his ability to salvage desperate situations. Model ordered an immediate evacuation of his headquarters. Staff officers later recalled the field marshal stuffing clothes into a suitcase so hastily that it burst open in the street, scattering his underwear across the pavement. But if Model's initial reaction was confusion, his recovery was swift and decisive. Within minutes, he had grasped the essential nature of the Allied plan. They were coming for the bridges. He issued orders by telephone to every unit within reach. The 9th SS Panzer Division would defend Arnhem and destroy the British paratroopers. The 10th SS Panzer Division would move south to Nijmegen and prevent the Allied ground forces from linking up. Every available soldier, clerk, cook, and driver was to be formed into battle groups and thrown into the fight. Model's presence at Oosterbeek was pure coincidence. His decision to locate his headquarters there had nothing to do with the Allied operation. But that coincidence would prove catastrophic for the British. The man now directing the German response was a master of improvisation, a commander who had repeatedly turned chaos into victory on the Eastern Front. He would do so again. While 2 of the British battalions ran into German blocking positions and became entangled in fierce street fighting, the 2nd Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost found a clearer path. Frost led his men along the northern bank of the Rhine, skirting the German defenses that were forming to the north. He carried a hunting horn, a personal affectation that served a practical purpose. When his companies became scattered in the confusion of the advance, the sound of the horn guided them back together. The railway bridge at Oosterbeek was blown by German engineers, just as the first British soldiers set foot on it, sending men tumbling into the Rhine. The pontoon bridge proved to be missing its entire center section. But the road bridge, the great steel span that was the prize of the entire operation, still stood. Frost and his men reached the northern approaches to the bridge as darkness fell. They were fewer than he had hoped. Casualties, stragglers, and units, diverted to other tasks, had reduced his force to approximately 740 men. The plan had called for nearly 9,000 to hold Arnhem. Frost had less than a tenth of that number. The paratroopers moved quickly into the buildings overlooking the bridge. They smashed windows to prevent glass from becoming shrapnel, pushed furniture against the frames for cover, and filled every available container with water. They were preparing for a siege, though they expected it to last only 48 hours. By then, the tanks of 30th Corps would arrive from the south. What Frost did not know was that he had missed the Germans by mere hours. SS Captain Victor Grabner's reconnaissance battalion had crossed the Arnhem Bridge heading south toward Nijmegen earlier that same evening. Grabner had left no guards behind. Had he lingered, had he posted even a small force at the bridge, Frost's battalion would have found their objective in German hands. Instead, the British took possession of buildings that commanded the northern approaches to the most important bridge in the Netherlands. The first probing attacks came after midnight. German armored cars approached the British positions and were driven off by fire from PIAT anti-tank weapons. Frost's men settled in for the night, confident that morning would bring good news from the south. It did not. Dawn on September 18th revealed the full scale of the disaster unfolding around them. The 1st and 3rd Parachute Battalions had been stopped cold. German blocking lines under an SS officer named Ludwig Spindler had formed across every route into Arnhem. The British battalions were being chewed to pieces in street-by-street fighting. Major General Urquhart, the division commander, had gone forward to assess the situation and become trapped in an attic, hiding from German patrols. He would remain out of contact with his headquarters for 18 hours, leaving the division leaderless at its moment of greatest crisis. The radios, meanwhile, had failed almost completely. The wireless set number 22 had an effective range of 5 kilometers under ideal conditions. Divisional headquarters was 13 kilometers from the bridge. The terrain, the buildings, the distance, all conspired to render British communications worthless. Some sets had been accidentally tuned to frequencies used by German and British broadcasting stations. Frost could not reach his division. His division could not reach 30th Corps. The battle was being fought blind. At 9:30 on the morning of the 18th, the sound of engines echoed from the south side of the bridge. For a moment, Frost's men dared to hope. Perhaps the tanks of 30th Corps had arrived ahead of schedule. Perhaps relief had come. Then the first vehicle appeared on the bridge. It was not a Sherman tank. It was a German armored car. SS Captain Victor Grabner had returned from Nijmegen. He had been told that only a handful of British paratroopers held the northern end of the bridge, lightly armed men who could be swept aside by a determined assault. Grabner ordered his battalion of 22 armored vehicles to charge across the span at full speed. He stood in the turret of a captured British Humber staff car, Knight's Cross gleaming at his throat, and signaled the advance. The first 4 or 5 vehicles roared across before the British could react. Then, the paratroopers opened fire with everything they had. Pat rounds slammed into half-tracks. 6-pounder anti-tank guns tore through armored cars. Grenades arced down from upper windows. The German column dissolved into a chaos of burning vehicles and dying men. For 2 hours, the battle raged on the bridge approaches. When it was over, 12 German vehicles lay wrecked and smoking. More than 70 SS soldiers were dead, including Grabner himself. His body was never recovered. The British cheered their victory, shouting their battalion battle cry across the burning wreckage, "Woe Mohammed!" They had stopped the first major German assault. They had held the bridge. But as Frost surveyed the aftermath, he understood the true cost of the morning's triumph. His men had expended vast quantities of ammunition that could not be replaced. The resupply drops had fallen into German hands or missed the drop zones entirely. The radios remained silent. No word had come from the division, from the other battalions, from 30th Corps. 740 men held the north end of the Arnhem Bridge. They had been promised relief in 48 hours. Those hours were already slipping away. And somewhere to the south, the tanks that were supposed to save them had covered barely 7 miles on the first day of the advance. The corridor was already failing. Frost and his men simply did not know it yet. The 19th of September brought no relief to Arnhem. Instead, it brought the systematic destruction of everything Lieutenant Colonel Frost and his men had fought to hold. The German commanders had learned from Grabner's failure. There would be no more headlong charges across the bridge. Instead, they brought up tanks, self-propelled guns, and artillery. They positioned their heavy weapons where they could fire directly into the British-held buildings at point-blank range. And then they began to demolish them, one by one. The technique was methodical and merciless. An 88mm gun would fire into a building until the walls began to collapse. Mortars would drop rounds onto the roof, starting fires that spread downward through the floors. When the structure was sufficiently weakened, German infantry would assault whatever remained. The British defenders would fall back to the next building, and the process would begin again. Frost's perimeter shrank by the hour. Men who had held an entire block now held a single house. The wounded accumulated in cellars and basements where they could not be evacuated. Water ran out. The fires could not be fought. Ammunition dwindled to a handful of rounds per man. Some soldiers scavenged German weapons from the dead, turning captured Mausers and Schmeissers against their former owners. Through it all, the radios remained silent. Frost could not reach divisional headquarters. He did not know that the 1st and 3rd Parachute Battalions had been virtually annihilated trying to break through to him. He did not know that Major General Urquhart had finally returned to his headquarters after 18 hours trapped behind German lines, only to find his division shattered beyond recognition. He did not know that a final desperate relief attempt was being organized for the morning of the 19th, throwing every remaining battalion into one last push toward the bridge. That attack began before dawn on September 19th. 4 battalions, the remnants of the 1st and 3rd Parachute Battalions, the 11th Parachute Battalion and the 2nd South Staffordshires, advanced through a narrow corridor between the railway line to the north and the river to the south. It was the only approach the Germans had not completely sealed. They walked into a killing ground. German machine guns swept the streets from both flanks. Mortars dropped among the advancing columns. Snipers picked off officers and NCOs. The 4 battalions were torn apart before they had covered half the distance to the bridge. By midday, all 4 had ceased to exist as fighting units. The survivors, fewer than 200 men from a force that had numbered in the thousands, fell back toward Oosterbeek. Urquhart made the only decision left to him. He ordered all remaining forces to form a defensive perimeter around the village of Oosterbeek, with headquarters at the Hartenstein Hotel. The division would hold a bridgehead on the north bank of the Rhine and wait for 30th Corps to arrive. The bridge, the objective of the entire operation, was abandoned to its fate. Frost and his 700 men were on their own. The 20th of September was the 4th day of the battle, twice as long as the paratroopers had been told they would need to hold. By morning, fewer than 150 men remained capable of fighting. German tanks rolled up to the surviving buildings and fired directly through the windows. The defenders had nothing left to stop them. At midday, a 2-hour truce was arranged to evacuate the wounded. German medics moved among the British casualties with professional efficiency. SS officers who had spent days trying to kill these men now treated them with what survivors later described as courtesy and respect. The fighting, one German remarked, had been worthy of admiration. Frost was among the wounded, both legs shattered by mortar fragments. He had refused evacuation for hours, continuing to direct the defense from a stretcher. Now he was carried out to German captivity, passing through streets choked with rubble and corpses. He would spend the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp, liberated by Patton's forces in March of 1945. Command passed to Major Freddie Goff, but there was little left to command. By early afternoon, the last organized resistance at the bridge collapsed. German infantry swept through the remaining British positions, capturing those too wounded to flee. The final radio message went out from somewhere in the ruins. Out of ammo. God save the king. Only German intercept operators heard it. The men of the 2nd Parachute Battalion had been told to hold the Arnhem Bridge for 48 hours. They held it for 96. 81 British soldiers died in the defense. German casualties were never officially tallied, but they were heavy. The bridge, the objective that was supposed to end the war by Christmas, was now firmly in German hands. 15 miles to the south, events were unfolding that should have rendered the sacrifice at Arnhem meaningful. The great road bridge at Nijmegen still stood, and General Gavin was determined to take it. For 3 days, the 82nd Airborne and the Guards Armored Division had battered at the German defenses around Nijmegen without success. Frontal assaults on the bridge had been thrown back with heavy losses. German Kampfgruppe Uhling, reinforced by elements of the 10th SS Panzer Division, held the southern approaches with fanatical determination. Gavin concluded that the bridge could not be taken from one side alone. It would have to be assaulted from both ends simultaneously. The plan was desperate, bordering on suicidal. Major Julian Cook's 3rd Battalion of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment would cross the river wall in small boats, land on the northern bank, and attack the bridge from behind while tanks and infantry assaulted from the south. The crossing would be made in broad daylight, across 400 yards of open water, under direct observation and fire from German positions on the far shore. The boats arrived late, delayed by the chaos on Hell's Highway. They were flimsy canvas craft, designed for river crossings but barely adequate for the task. There were only 26 of them, far fewer than the 33 that had been promised. Some had no paddles. The paratroopers would have to row with their rifle butts. At 3 o'clock on the afternoon of September 20th, Cook's battalion launched into the wall. The Germans opened fire immediately. Machine guns swept the water. Mortars dropped among the struggling boats. Artillery rounds sent geysers of water into the air. Men died before they had traveled 50 yards from shore. Captain Henry Keep, who had once rowed for Princeton, watched the carnage unfold around him. The boats were all crammed with frantically paddling men, he later wrote. Set to the deafening roar of omnipresent firing, this scene of defenseless, frail canvas boats, all jammed to overflowing with humanity, all striving desperately to cross the wall as quickly as possible and get to a place where at least they could fight. This was fiendish and dreadful. We looked like a bunch of animals, void of dignity and normalcy. Of the 26 boats that launched, only 11 reached the far shore. 48 Americans were killed in the crossing. 200 more were wounded. The survivors, soaked, exhausted, and enraged, stormed up the northern bank and threw themselves at the German positions. Within hours, they had seized the northern end of the bridge. From the south, tanks of the Grenadier Guards began to cross. The Gistreef was in Allied hands by nightfall on September 20th. The road to Arnhem lay open. Only 8 miles separated 30th Corps from the British paratroopers still holding out at Oosterbeek. And then the tanks stopped. The reasons for the halt remain disputed to this day. German Tiger tanks and infantry had established blocking positions at the town of Elst, directly astride the road to Arnhem. The guards were exhausted after days of continuous fighting. Night was falling, and armored advances in darkness invited ambush. The infantry needed to catch up before the tanks could safely proceed. Whatever the justification, the effect was devastating. The Americans, who had paddled across the wall in canvas boats, who had watched their friends die in the water, who had fought their way across the bridge believing that every minute counted, could not believe what they were seeing. British tanks, just 8 miles from Arnhem, were stopping for the night. The British were supposed to close the gap, one American paratrooper said later, but they stopped for goddamn tea. By the time 30th Corps resumed its advance the following morning, it was too late. The bridge at Arnhem had fallen. Frost's men were dead or captured. The prize for which so many had sacrificed was now irretrievably lost. 8 miles, 18 hours, the margin between triumph and catastrophe. The Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade had been created for one purpose: to liberate Poland. Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski had formed the unit from Polish exiles in Scotland, men who had escaped the German conquest of their homeland and burned to return. They trained for years, waiting for the moment when they would drop into Warsaw and lead a national uprising against the Nazi occupiers. That moment never came. Instead, the British pressured the Polish government in exile to release the brigade for operations in Western Europe. Sosabowski protested. He warned that Market Garden was flawed, that the distances were too great, that the single road was too vulnerable, that the Germans were stronger than Allied intelligence believed. His objections were dismissed. On the 21st of September, 4 days after the operation began, his paratroopers finally dropped into the Netherlands. They landed at Driel, a small village on the southern bank of the Rhine, directly across from the British perimeter at Oosterbeek. They were supposed to cross the river by ferry and reinforce the beleaguered 1st Airborne Division. But the ferry had been sunk days earlier. The northern bank was held by German forces who had spent 4 days preparing their defenses. And the weather that had grounded the brigade in England for so long had given the Germans all the time they needed. Sosabowski's men attempted to cross the Rhine in rubber boats under cover of darkness. German machine guns opened fire from the heights on the opposite shore. Mortars dropped among the boats. Most were destroyed or swept away by the current. Over 2 nights of desperate effort, only about 200 Poles made it across to the Oosterbeek perimeter. The rest remained trapped on the southern bank, able to hear the fighting but unable to join it. Sosabowski was furious. He confronted the British commanders, demanding a coordinated assault to break through to Arnhem. He argued that relief was still possible if they acted with sufficient force and speed. The British generals listened and then overruled him. The Polish general, who had warned that the plan would fail, was now being told that nothing more could be done. It was not the last injustice Sosabowski would suffer. Across the river, the Oosterbeek perimeter was dying by inches. What had once been a division of 10,000 men was now a pocket of fewer than 3,000, compressed into an area roughly 1 mile across. The Hartenstein Hotel served as headquarters, its elegant rooms converted into command posts and aid stations. The wounded filled every available space. The dead could not be buried. German artillery and mortars fell constantly, turning the manicured grounds into a moonscape of craters and shattered trees. The defenders fought with whatever they could find. Ammunition was so scarce that men counted their remaining rounds in single digits. Food had run out days earlier. Water came from rain collected in helmets and shell holes. Yet still they held, repelling German assaults that came from every direction. SS infantry would breach the perimeter at one point, only to be thrown back by counterattacks at another. The fighting was hand-to-hand in places, paratroopers and SS men grappling in the ruins of Dutch homes. What kept the perimeter alive was artillery. The 64th Medium Regiment had established radio contact with 30th Corps, and through this single fragile link, the survivors at Oosterbeek could call down fire on German positions. Every major assault was broken up by accurate shell fire before it could overwhelm the defenders. Without this support, the perimeter would have collapsed days earlier. But artillery could not stop the inevitable. Each day the pocket shrank. Each night brought fewer men to hold the line. The Germans were not in a hurry. They knew that time was on their side. They could afford to grind down the British with mortars and snipers, conserving their strength for the final assault. To the south, Hell's Highway was under constant attack. German forces had counterattacked at multiple points along the corridor, briefly cutting the road between Eindhoven and Nijmegen. The 101st Airborne fought what General Taylor called Indian warfare, a constant series of skirmishes and ambushes as German units probed for weaknesses. Supplies that were desperately needed at the front sat in traffic jams stretching for miles. The narrow corridor that was supposed to end the war had become a liability, a thin thread that the Germans were trying to sever. On the 24th of September, the commanders met at Valberg to decide the fate of the 1st Airborne Division. Lieutenant General Horrocks was there, along with Browning and Major General Ivor Thomas of the 43rd Wessex Division. Sosabowski attended as well, still arguing for one more attempt to break through to Arnhem. He was overruled. The position at Oosterbeek was untenable. Further attempts at relief would only add to the casualties without changing the outcome. The decision was made to evacuate whatever remained of the 1st Airborne Division across the Rhine. The operation would be called Berlin. Major General Urquhart received the order with grim resignation. He had known for days that this moment was coming. Now he had to organize the extraction of his surviving men, while leaving behind those too wounded to move. The medical staff would stay with the casualties. Everyone else would attempt to cross the river under cover of darkness. The evacuation began at 10 o'clock on the night of September 25th. The men wrapped their boots in cloth to muffle their footsteps. Tape marked the routes through the darkness to the riverbank. Artillery fired continuously to mask the sounds of movement and to keep the Germans heads down. A cold rain began to fall, soaking the exhausted soldiers but providing additional cover. Royal Engineers and Royal Canadian Engineers waited at the water's edge with small boats. The crossing points were under German observation, and flares periodically lit the river like daylight. Machine gun fire swept the water whenever movement was detected. Some boats were hit and sank, others capsized in the current. But most made it across, ferrying load after load of survivors to the southern shore. The evacuation continued through the night. Men who had fought for 9 days without sleep stumbled down to the boats in a daze. Some collapsed from exhaustion before they could reach the water and had to be carried by their comrades. Others, too badly wounded to walk, were left behind with the medical staff. The Germans began to realize what was happening near dawn, but by then most of the survivors had escaped. When the final count was made, 2,398 men had crossed to safety. Behind them, on the northern bank of the Rhine, more than 7,500 of their comrades remained. 1,485 were dead or would die of their wounds. 6,525 were prisoners of war. The 1st Airborne Division had effectively ceased to exist. The total cost of Operation Market Garden exceeded 17,000 Allied casualties, more than the losses suffered on D-Day. The British 1st Airborne Division alone had lost nearly 80% of its strength. The Polish brigades suffered 40% casualties. The American Airborne Divisions lost approximately 3,500 men between them. 30th Corps and the supporting ground units added another 1,500 to the toll. The Royal Air Force lost 294 aircrew killed in the transport and resupply missions. German losses were never precisely calculated, but they were substantial. Official reports acknowledged 3,300 casualties around Arnhem alone, including 1,300 dead. Across the entire length of the corridor, from the Belgian border to the Rhine, German losses may have reached 13,000. The fighting had cost both sides dearly. The Dutch paid as well. 453 civilians died during the battle. The German command, furious at Dutch cooperation with the Allies, ordered the entire population of Arnhem evacuated. More than 100,000 people were driven from their homes. Many would not return until after the war. In the winter that followed, German reprisals and the disruption of food supplies led to what the Dutch still call the Hunger Winter. 22,000 civilians died of starvation before liberation finally came in May of 1945. Field Marshal Montgomery declared Operation Market Garden 90% successful. The men who had fought at Arnhem might have disagreed. They had been asked to hold a bridge for 48 hours. They held it for 96, and still no one came. The war did not end by Christmas. The Rhine would not be crossed until March of 1945. The narrow thrust that was supposed to finish the war extended it by at least 6 months. In the aftermath, the British commanders needed someone to blame. They chose Sosabowski. Montgomery wrote that the Polish brigade had fought badly, that the men showed no keenness to fight. It was a lie. Sosabowski was relieved of command in December. His brigade went on hunger strike in protest. The general who had warned that Arnhem was a bridge too far spent his remaining years working in a London factory. He died in poverty in 1967. 61 years later, the Netherlands finally acknowledged the truth. In 2006, Queen Beatrix awarded Sosabowski the Bronze Lion and his brigade the Military Order of William, the highest Dutch military honor. The scapegoat had become a hero. The bridge at Arnhem still stands. It was renamed the John Frost Bridge in 1977. Every September, thousands gather at Oosterbeek Cemetery to honor those who fell. Dutch children place flowers on the graves of men who died before their grandparents were born. And every evening at sunset, the lights on the crossing bridge in Nijmegen flicker to life, 1 pair at a time at marching pace, 48 pairs of lights. 48 men who paddled across the wall in canvas boats and never came home. The bridge still stands. The men are gone. But the march goes on.